Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome this morning. We understand there's still a few traffic snarls in town. I guess that goes without saying in most cases in Washington. I'm Jack Gerard, the President CEO of the American Petroleum Institute, and we want to welcome you here to our forum today. As you probably are well aware, the API represents all aspects of America's oil and natural gas industry, from essentially exploration and production down to the fuel pump, or the marketing side, if you will, of our downstream activities. Now, we're excited about the energy discussion, particularly as it relates to our elections coming up. And before I turn it to a distinguished panel that we've invited to participate today, I want to first share with you some polling results, or a poll that we just concluded in the field that we will release today. And it ties closely the issue most important to the American public, and that is job creation, economic recovery, and then, of course, the issues of energy. First, we found in the poll, which we will be releasing today, and I think we'll have copies made available to anybody who's interested in it, that 71% of all voters say they are more likely to vote for a candidate in 2016 if he or she supports producing more oil and natural gas from right here in the U.S. And that support is shared across all political spectrums. Survey found that 64% of Democrats, 64% of independents, and 85% of Republicans support a more pro-development candidate as part of our elections that are coming up a year from now. Further, these strong majorities, as I mentioned earlier, suggest the close nexus and tie to that which is most important to the American public, job creation and economic recovery, and it shows that strong support on a nonpartisan basis. The study also found that 83% of Democrats, 85% of independents, and 95% of Republicans felt that increased domestic oil and natural gas access would create more jobs right here in the United States. 78% of Democrats, 80% of independents, and 96% of Republican voters felt that it would stimulate our economy even further. And 76% of Democrats, 75% of independents, I know you're getting tired of these numbers, and 89% of Republicans thought it would help lower our energy cost for all American consumers. So in conclusion, the one thing the poll makes abundantly clear is that a strong majority of American citizens strongly support expanded development, production, and activities associated with oil and natural gas. Energy is closely tied, as I mentioned earlier, to the issues that matter most to them: job creation, economic recovery. Among the poll's other findings, which we find very interesting, is you have strong support clear across the spectrum from production to refining. But on the flip side, you have strong opposition to things like increased taxes that would hinder or further impede our ability to produce America's energy, and also strong opposition to government mandates like the Renewable Fuel Standard, which would discourage additional oil and natural gas activities. So as 2016 election kicks into high gear, what we'll be doing at the API associated with our Vote for Energy campaign is to continue to encourage a public discourse, a dialogue around the issues associated with energy that lead us to further job creation and economic recovery. We have for some time, as many of you know, in the last election cycle, by engaging the public in this process, in this discourse of energy policy, we believe it produces the best energy policy coming from the Congress, from state legislatures, and from state and localities. So I would now like to turn the time over to Alana Shore, who'll be moderating a distinguished panel today of experts who know about the nexus between energy policy, American voters, and what this means for the election coming up in 2016. And encourage you all to take a moment to study the results of our poll and our finding, and to watch closely as we unfold our Vote for Energy campaign, because we believe it will be a significant issue as we already start to see various candidates take positions on different energy issues, but it will be a significant issue in the 2016 election cycle. So with that, Alana, let me turn to you. Thank you very much for doing this today, and thank you for being here today, this morning.
Thanks so much. Thanks everyone for being here. I have a very distinguished panel that I'm very fortunate to be joined by. On my immediate right is Glenn Bolger, the partner and co-founder of Public Opinion Strategies. Right over here is Rob Engstrom, Senior Vice President and National Political Director at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And on his left is Keith Frederick, owner of Frederick I'm sorry, over here.
I went to the right.
To the right, my other left. And here is Nathan Gonzalez, editor and publisher of the Rothenberg and Gonzalez Political Report. Thanks so much for being here with us today. It's been a busy news week already, so let's just dive right into what's going on with energy. One of my strongest takeaways from the API poll that was released today was the breadth of bipartisan support for the notion that the US needs to produce more oil and natural gas domestically, and for the notion that the industry needs to be sort of freed from regulations from a lot of, what API itself wants to get done on Capitol Hill. Yet you see energy becoming as polarizing and as partisan as it ever has in the political dialogue itself. So how would you folks explain this disconnect? And can 2016 help alleviate that in any way? Or will we end up with essentially the same kind of divided government we see now, with a Democrat in the White House who doesn't necessarily support increased production and a Republican Congress that does?
Well, thank you first for having us, Jack. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. And also, I think that the results from the survey are indicative of what we see at the U.S. Chamber when we meet with 150 candidates of both political parties each cycle, and we inquire as to their positions on these issues. And I believe that there is a bipartisan consensus on energy policy, and I think that it comes into three buckets. Jack's survey and API survey, I think, demonstrates that. And the first is, from our perspective, is remove the threat that has been foisted upon our collective membership from the Environmental Protection Agency in particular. Started in the light of day in the halls of Congress in the first couple years of this administration. That's the first thing that needs to get done, and I think that there are Democrats and Republicans that share that view. The second piece is to establish certainty, and the third piece is to allow America's job creators to get back on offense. I think this is a bipartisan issue. I think that in states like Colorado last cycle, particularly in the Senate race, I think Gardner was able to talk about the energy issue in a way that gained and garnered support from Republicans, also moderates in both political parties, and some Democrats. And I think that that's the model for the candidates that we'll be supporting in 2016.
Mm-hmm. And any thoughts from our polling folks in particular on whether 2016 could produce, voters casting their ballots for a Democrat for the Senate or a Republican for the White House, right? Because that's what we've seen, essentially, this kind of divided government pattern that's led to a lot of stalemates in all areas, not just energy.
Well, one of the reasons for that is that the Democrats do have a huge advantage going for the White House. First of all, they have the Electoral College advantage, where they don't need to win that many swing states. When you look at the states that they've won, 7 of the last 7 presidential elections, that gets them to 242 electoral votes. They only need 270 to win. So Republicans have to run the table almost in all of the swing states. So it's much easier for the Democrats to win that. But then when it comes down to Congress, especially the House, that's the Republican bulwark against a Democratic president, obviously. And in the Senate is clearly up for grabs this time. Republicans had the geographic advantage last time. This time the Democrats, have it tilted a bit in to their playing field. It's certainly going to be very close, I think. But what's interesting when you get back to the issue of energy, the American public is relatively united on this issue, and bipartisan. And you don't necessarily see that from the political leaders, particularly. And I'm sure Keith may have a different perspective, but particularly on the Democratic side, because when you look at the activists and a lot of the fundraisers, the check writers on the Democratic side, the environmental issues are extraordinarily important to them. So that's when you see the Democratic leadership kind of playing to that, as opposed to a bipartisan energy strategy of less reliance on foreign oil, more domestic production, and less regulation. And also, clearly, there is support for an all-of-the-above strategy. When you look in focus groups, for example, what swing voters tell me is, look, it's nuts to think that we can do away with domestic energy production. we need oil and gas. We're not ready yet. These other wind and solar and others are important and going to be a growing part of it, but we're not ready to transition fully. And that's where you see the bipartisan support for this energy policy.
Keith, thoughts on that for the Democrats?
Well, Glenn and I often agree more than we disagree, unfortunately. But Americans are very pragmatic when it comes to energy. You know, everyone either has a car or has to get around. So they understand the price of gasoline, and having it go down is good for them. They understand the basics of supply and demand, that more domestic production can mean lower cost for their at the gas pump. You know, they're also, you know, on the Democratic side, as Glenn pointed out, a strong environmental strain that plays a lot in politics. But natural gas is the perfect play for that. You know, not only is it jobs, but it's cleaner air. And what's happening with the Clean Power Plan out of the EPA, you know, driving more electricity production to natural gas. Those are all things that Americans like and they, you know, and they agree with. You know, and when job production comes along with it, and international security, it all just keeps adding and adding to the equation. So I think there's a lot of common ground on energy.
And yet, we have Hillary Clinton, the Democratic frontrunner, moving pretty sharply to the left on some key issues lately, coming out against Keystone, coming out against future Arctic drilling. So you're setting up this really consequential binary choice on the presidential ticket between a united Republican front that supports all of, you know, what Jack wants to talk about, increased production, increased offshore access, and you have a Democratic front that's united against that. So how do you square, you know, this bipartisan support with the way that the field is sort of parting?
Right. Well, because there's lots of different dimensions, obviously, to all of this. And I think it's a little harder on the Democratic side to sell the oil production as it is the natural gas production. I mean, natural gas is more of a solution. You know, when Barack Obama first came into office, nuclear was his big deal, which he was going to promote because of its clean energy production, you know, and its jobs capabilities. Solar is clearly also out there, and it's becoming more and more affordable, you know, but without storage, you still need peak demand, you know, electricity generation. And Americans aren't stupid, and they don't want to go back to the dark ages, literally, the dark ages at 6 o'clock at night when they come home. So you're going to need production. You're going to need production of energy in order to fill that need. And that's sort of where the swing voter really plays into all that. Not on the extremes, more in the middle.
Now, part of this is too that if you look at Hillary Clinton's experience, her last election was 2008, and she lost what was supposed to be a shoo-in Democratic nomination from the left. And so right now, her main focus is don't let me lose the nomination to a challenge from the left, and obviously that challenge is Bernie Sanders, who is more real than she expected, I think, or more of a thorn, I should say, than she expected. So she's doing everything she can to get to the left, and it's going to make it much harder for her to get back to where Americans are on energy, for example.
Absolutely.
I think that's one of the challenges to driving a bipartisan issue is that even though bipartisanship is, I think, talked about a lot and sort of placed on this pedestal, I don't believe that voters are rewarding bipartisanship. If you are a Democratic member who's working across the aisle or a Republican member who's working across the aisle, you're going to get met with a primary challenge. And so I just think there's a disincentive for that. And I think the other challenge with an issue like energy, where there might be bipartisan consensus, is that there's so many other issues going on that are dividing, whether it's Democrats driving, you know, women's issues, choice, abortion, you know, Republicans driving health care. This is a very crowded issue field when it comes to the election, and I think that those issues get the most attention.
And I think Nathan's right, and it manifests itself, this sort of war in the Republican Party. There's been a lot of discussion about in the primaries last time, and a lot of that was litigated, and it's being litigated also, I think, in both political parties, and part of it is that there has been a loss of the middle in this country, and I think energy policy is a place per the API survey where Democrats and Republicans can come together on a bipartisan basis with regard to natural gas, with regard to nuclear, with regard to a mix and blend of a variety of different sources, as Jack also mentioned. But you can't reestablish a governing middle in this country with only one political party at the table. So I think it's also incumbent upon Democrats, particularly in the Senate, who come from energy-producing states, to exert greater influence within their party to come to the table on the issues where we do agree.
And I think Senators Manchin and Heitkamp would definitely tell you they're trying. They're
Yes,
certainly trying.
They're trying.
But you make a great point about the left sort of moving further left and the right moving further right, and there's very little incentive to work in the middle. But you still see, Chairman Fred Upton trying to pass a bipartisan bill, Chairman Lisa Murkowski trying to pass a bipartisan bill. The problem is that in this crowded field, right? I mean, energy sometimes doesn't get the airtime, so we end up having these consequential, controversial debates over the Keystone pipeline, crude exports, without talking, right, about a national energy policy. So my next question to you folks is whether that can change in 2017, whether we can have an election where it's no longer about these individual hot-button issues, but a national energy policy, which we all agree we need.
I think the pendulum has swung to the left dramatically, as I mentioned earlier, in the light of day in halls of Congress with cap and trade and some other issues in the first couple years of this administration, and then certainly in the regulatory arena with the EPA, but also with the NLRB. We can look at Dodd-Frank, we can look at the healthcare law and those issues. So not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but when you look at 2018, there are 6 or 7 Democrats from bright red states and also purple states who have the ability and have demonstrated, like Senator Manchin, Senator McCaskill, we give credit there, Senator Tester, Senator Heitkamp, who have a demonstrated record on these issues. So our belief, even though we don't get involved in presidential politics, we do get involved in presidential policy. So we believe that there will be a moment, a window, for there to be a bipartisan consensus that could emerge. That's our play, past the primaries, through the elections. We'll be vigorous in both. But the ultimate goal, and I think where we'll be measured, is to establish that certainty and to have that opportunity on a bipartisan basis, particularly with regard to energy policy in the first 100 days of the next president.
I think one challenge facing energy in the 2016 election is it's an issue that impacts a lot of different issue clusters, but it also operates a little bit in the shadows in terms of, when you think about its impact on jobs and the economy, it's huge. But people think of it as, oh, well, it's just part of jobs in the economy, or it's part of my cost of living. And Keith's right. Everybody knows where to get the cheapest gas, near where they live. Everybody knows the price of a gallon of gas. But in terms of, national security, it is a huge factor in our national and security and our foreign policy, but it's not necessarily what the news media, for example, leads with when they talk about, national security. So that's one of the challenges, and certainly API is taking that on with its campaign in terms of being energy voters, and that's important to do because it won't just, I don't think it would automatically happen by itself. I think, it's important for this group, for example, to be talking about that.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of its economic impact, that leads really nicely into our next question, which deals with the whole issue of cost. One of the big findings in the API poll is that, as one would expect, voters do not want to see policies that would drive up their energy costs. Right. Yet, it's very easy to message, a regulation that might be found to drive up energy costs as important and necessary, say for climate change, say for another reason. Political messaging allows you to kind of twist and sell what you need to sell. So, especially when we have a lot of regulations on the table in this election, from the Clean Power Plan to the Renewable Fuel Standard, how do you see that tension between, messaging about the role of government, to swing voters who might say, yeah, I do think we need government help here, and the messaging about the cost, which is also accurate, that it'll drive up fuel? How does that tension get resolved in your view on the campaign trail?
Well, I think that the definition of being pro-business depends upon your neighborhood and where you live. And so what matters in North Dakota in terms of the energy revolution, where we have counties that have 0.7% unemployment, they have sort of a different set of problems, can't build the roads fast enough, can't build the houses fast enough. That's very different than what the energy footprint and what the messaging might be for my friend Dan Donovan in New York One. So I think that what we have to talk about is, a trusted message, but also trusted messengers. And one thing that I think API has done a phenomenal job with this campaign is talking about the localized impacts of federal policy. I think that's particularly important in a presidential election, where there are going to be billions and billions of dollars in the airways, certainly with regard to social media and all the various channels. And I think that it's important to find a way to talk about these issues and talk very specifically about the personal impacts, because if it doesn't matter to the voter, then they're going to turn off the message. And so one of the things we've done is worked very closely with the 1,600 state and local chambers, as well as trade associations across this country, very closely with Jack and his team, to find out the local, the trusted messenger who can deliver that message that can be salient, particularly when we've got a presidential election.
I think one of the challenges on messaging looking at how the parties tend to do business is that it's more difficult to get people fired up about something that has bipartisan, working towards something rather than working against something. And I feel like the parties have defaulted into just demonizing the other side, demonizing candidates. And where energy plays into that is, Democrats are, sure can be in their heart that Republicans are a group of knuckle-dragging folks who are against all sorts of issues, including climate deniers. I mean, you hear this term thrown out a lot. So, getting back to your original point about messaging, I'm not sure we're going to see that positive, from the party's perspective, that positive message. It might come from API or other groups, but it's about rallying people against something rather than people for something, I think, from a party perspective.
Thoughts on this from the polling perspective, the messaging on cost versus government impact?
Well, cost is always the most important thing to Americans. And I know in Washington we think it's ideology, but really it's what comes out of your wallet. And as I said before, energy is one of the major things that comes out of your wallet, and taxes. And so when one side can effectively say the other side wants to raise your taxes and raise your cost of energy, it can be very effective. It can be very effective. But as we saw with the Clean Power Plan in the EPA, they were, in that circumstance, it only targets heavy coal states and heavy coal users. So there might be 5 to 7 states where people are going to get stuck with a huge bill for this. But when you live on the East Coast and the West Coast and some urban centers in between, it looks fine. So there's a less of a political price to pay for that. I mean, that doesn't mean that the rhetoric around it can't get ginned up, but it kind of is going through because of that. And it means a shift. It'll mean a shift, and it's meant a shift already in how at least electricity is produced. So energy is an ever-evolving issue and an ever-evolving economy in our country. And the key is for whatever side to figure out where the new jobs are coming from. If you'll remember in 2012, even in 2010, Democrats, one of their major planks was green jobs, and it was all energy. It was all energy, We found out later that meant certain things that became a little more destructive to the Democratic Party. But in a certain sense, there's always something on the horizon that both sides can work with when it comes to energy.
I found your point about the positive messaging being rare a little interesting, because the other day, you all know the name Tom Steyer, I'm sure this audience. The other day I saw a Tom Steyer next-gen climate commercial that started to put less of an anti-oil spin on things and said, we can do it, America, this positive message of roll up your sleeves and all solar panels. And I thought, hey, this is because oil prices are low. So, you've robbed this powerful Democratic donor of big oil, which was his favorite boogeyman beforehand. So the next question is, how do you think that changes things? Because, these NGOs and the Democrats who support them have lost a big enemy to kick around. You can't really say big oil because the industry is facing some tough times right now.
Well, I think Mr. Steyer didn't have a very successful election cycle last time. We welcomed him back to the field in 2016, and I think that if he thinks that changing the ads to be positive are going to somehow distract the American voters from his narrow, ideologically based agenda, I think he's going to have a tough cycle again.
So I don't get it. How does the chamber feel about
We're on
that?
the fence.
But truly, really, I mean, we all remember the subsidies campaigns the Democrats ran, wanting to take away the industry's tax benefits, saying, look, profits are up, it's time to sock the industry. Well, that's not the case anymore. We're facing a new reality. So how do you see that changing, if at all, campaign messaging, where the industry's at right now versus even 2 years ago?
Well, I think that, right now it's 2015. I think that Steyer and others from that perspective are going to go back to the negative. It may not necessarily be, quite the same as it was in 2014, but they're going to look for a new way. So I don't know that anybody here should be fooled by what they're doing right now. I think the expectation is going to be, as I think as Nathan pointed out, the negative is what drives people to action. Whether and of course, obviously, whether you believe the negative or not. And again, I think that what API is doing with its energy voter campaign is really smart, which is trying to find people who say, the cost of this is important. The national security aspect, the less dependence on foreign oil is very important. This is something that I should kind of factor into my vote, and I think that that's where the impact could be in 2016.
Right. And here's where the bipartisanship comes in, because all of that has been brought to you under a Democratic president. So to the point that Vote for Energy runs ads that says keep things going, it can help the Democrats because we have an incumbent party that this has taken place under. More energy production, #1 in the world, prices down. Those are all things that American voters, especially swing voters, want, and it's been brought to you under a Democrat. And if it's taken advantage of, it can be helpful to them.
And I think that's important. One of the biggest questions I have about this election, or one of the things that's missed, I think, by a lot of maybe my colleagues in the media, is that how this president leaves office, or how people feel about this president, is going to set the foundation for this election. If people feel like we're headed in the right direction, if they approve of the job he's doing, or he's at least kind of middle 50-50, then voters aren't going to be primed for change. But if voters don't like what the president has done overall, they don't like what he's done on energy, then they're going to be primed for change. They're going to be looking for an alternative, and it'll be up to Republicans to figure out if they can nominate someone who is an acceptable alternative for those voters.
Well, I know I talked earlier about these controversial hot button issues. Let's drill down into them for a second here, because last night I, for one, was kept pretty busy by some big Keystone XL news. You saw the company kind of turning the administration strategy on its own head, if you will, and saying, well, let's pause the review of this pipeline, and we could see this sort of kicked into the next administration, depending on how this shakes out. In 2012, we saw Keystone show up in a lot of campaign ads. We had, Governor Romney go out there and say, I'm going to build it myself. And in 2014, it was less of a campaign issue. It faded a little bit. It was there, but on the margins, because a lot of people started to realize, the president is probably going to say no. So given this new news, do you see Keystone leaping back to the forefront? Because now Republicans can say, look, the president really squandered this opportunity, or is it going to stay in the background?
I think it will be an issue again, simply because it is shorthand, easy to understand for voters, who's for this and who's against it. And people understand what this means, which is, again, it's not necessarily domestic energy production, but it's, more opportunity where we're not relying on, very stable places with strong, well-entrenched leadership like the Middle East, for instance, where, any day you don't know what's going to happen. Whereas Canada, even with the new government, it's still obviously a very stable country, and our neighbor next door, and they're not going to make decisions based on political whims, with the U.S. So I do think that Keystone will come back as an issue in 2016, partly because it's going to be shorthand between the Democratic nominee, likely obviously Hillary Clinton, and the Republican nominee as well.
Mm-hmm. Keith, agree, disagree?
Well, I'm probably ill-equipped to answer this because I tend to work for Democratic candidates who support Keystone. But I think in order to make it salient with all this other mix of issues that's out there in 2016, it's going to have to, again, hit a pocketbook for American public somewhere. I think if Tom Steyer tries to make it an issue and those ilk and say it's about global warming and pollution, that's sort of more of an esoteric idea that some people definitely care about a lot, but they are already knowing how they vote. If you're going to try to make this an issue that's actually going to swing vote back and forth, it's going to have to be some kind of pocketbook issue. I think that's a little bit difficult with something like the Keystone. But we'll see. It can be a jobs issue too, but we'll see.
I think it will come back. I think because it does in fact translate to specific jobs, I think that it is also an issue that, as you mentioned, does appeal to Democrats from energy producing states. And I think the other thing that compounds the problem on this particular issue is that, agree or disagree, it gets back to the issue that I mentioned earlier in terms of providing certainty. And I think certainly within our membership, we can accept the answer is no, but give us certainty so we can plan around it. Certainly we support vigorously with API the construction of the Keystone XL pipeline after numerous, countless reviews and a bipartisan consensus. But I think that providing that certainty to the business community is something that some voters may scratch their head and wonder why.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Another big issue, oil exports. You've seen, LNG exports become, a big bipartisan rallying point, and that took a couple years. Crude exports, it's moved a lot faster, and yet we're seeing it pass the House with 26 Democratic votes. However, it's facing this point in the Senate where it's not yet at 60. A lot of folks are saying maybe we should wait until there's a Republican president in the White House and we won't need to concede anything to the Democrats. We can just get this done. How do you see the 2016 election affecting this oil exports debate? Because there's powerful messaging on both sides, the geopolitical benefits of exports versus, a lot of things that have been debunked by studies, a lot of ads saying your gas prices will go up, no matter the studies that debunk it. We've got two powerful messages. How does that square out?
I think there's a lot of wait and see. I don't know if there's a lot of incentive for the parties to work together to get the big things done because the election, it's a year away, but people say, well, let's just cool our heels and just wait because we have no idea what the balance of power is going to be a year from now. And so I guess I hate to bring a lot of pessimism to the table, but I guess I'm skeptical that big ticket items are going to get done because there's optimism on both sides that, well, maybe Democrats capture the Senate, maybe Republicans capture the White House and say, well, what if we're in charge? Then we'll set the parameters of the debate.
Other thoughts on that?
I think it's going to be a little challenging to pass it between now and the next election. I think the election, as Nathan pointed out, is going to be a kind of a reset point for this issue. What we don't, I think, fully know the extent of is when it becomes a major debate topic. And I don't mean debate as in one of these presidential debates. I mean in terms of what the public is what the media, what the public, what the elected officials are talking about, and those running for office are talking about. I don't think we've gotten there yet. But how much populism is there going to be in response to this in terms of, wait, don't send our domestic, oil overseas. Mm-hmm. Don't help these other countries out. We need to keep the prices low. So until that debate gets going, I don't know that it's easy to project where the public is going to come down on this.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of those issues, like Glenn says, you never know what's going to come up. I mean, in 14, in October, we were talking about Ebola and ISIS. That seemed to be the big issues in the campaign, okay? So we never know, but this one has...
And by the way, I'll point out the Republican Senate has stopped Ebola.
Yeah.
So anyway, go on.
Look, it worked. Vote Republican, Ebola's gone. So this issue, though, has lots of interesting cross currents to it. I think the sense of American exceptionalism, the sense of maybe, jingoism's not the right word, but, that strong patriotism, you can really, it can cut both ways. It can cut one way of, let's increase production, let's be the #1 oil producer in the world, let's make a lot of money, and let's control what other people think of us and deal with us in our relationships. On the other side, it can be, it's ours. It's ours, let's use it, let's keep it here. Let's say no to the rest of the world, maybe a little Rand Paul curtain around us, and let's keep our prices down. And I think that has a cross current to it that can work for both parties. It's kind of an interesting issue, and it may pop up. You never know.
Do you see a lot of incentive to get that debate going before 2016? What you're talking about, sort of, fomented in individual races, or less incentive given how powerful the opposite arguments are? Can this be a winning argument, let's say, for a Senate candidate?
At least on the Republican side, I would be hesitant to want to start making that argument right now because I think that there is going to be the cross current of, let's do this as opposed to the more populist argument of keep it all for ourselves. So I think it would be a little bit of, at this point in time, a little bit risky to kind of make that a centerpiece in a campaign on the Republican side.
How about for Democrats?
The answer to that is there's kind of an institutional bias against it. Because Democrats, and Nathan can talk about this, I mean, they tend to like to run campaigns on other issues right now, and they kind of have a little bit of a focus on, on issues they think work best for them as Democrats. And it's kind of hard to get outside of that into something like this.
Right. And energy has rarely been among those issues, as you mentioned. It's mostly women's issues.
I mean, women, if you were to ask a Democratic strategist, a real one, not the ones that play them on cable television, but it is heavy on women's issues.
And a little
they
bit
feel
on
emboldened, and it really, we go back and forth about the Colorado Senate race last time and whether Democrats overplayed their hand, and there really isn't a lot of disagreement, I think, on the Democratic side. They feel like there were other factors that were going on, and it's full steam ahead on those, on so-called women's issues, and not specifically on energy, even climate change.
Interesting.
I think just finally part of it is also what issues are going to be salient in the campaign, during the campaign time, and then what issues are going to be part of a governing mandate that may not necessarily pop during the campaign time, but where we may, on some of these issues, be able to cobble together bipartisan majorities, hopefully with a new president that may not be the focus of an ad campaign, but may be part of a lower, a lower key substantive bipartisan majority.
Interesting. To turn to something that was discussed earlier by, I think it was you, Keith, the difference between oil and natural gas.
Yes.
Natural gas is understood as a cleaner alternative. It replaces coal when, when utilities burn power. And yet, I find, at least talking to voters when I do get the chance to do that, there's a disconnect. People don't understand that it's the oil and gas industry. That a lot of oil companies that what we perceive as in the public are actually, predominantly natural gas companies at this point. So can that be reconciled in terms of political communication? You have this one clean fuel and this one fuel that Democrats and NGOs like to demonize, but it's the same industry bringing them both to you.
Right.
Can that be better communicated?
It can be, and I think at least on the Democratic side of the perspective, for Democrats themselves and maybe independent-leaning Democrats, a lot of it has to do with the environmental impact of the production. And as long as folks are relatively or certainly, convinced that it is environmentally benign to extract, then they're all for it. They really are. There's very few who are on the far extreme of, take me off the grid and don't produce anything. So that's really a very important sort of threshold to get over for the folks on that side of the political spectrum. And then at that point, I don't really think there's much of a problem. And that's sort of one of the things with the Keystone Pipeline that, while it's hammered as a jobs, the fact that it's safe environmentally, I know that's part of the messaging, but that certainly can help it get over the hump with public opinion. But in terms of separating the industries, no, I think that it's more the source itself where people really are focused on, natural gas is a nice, clean alternative. Yeah.
Other thoughts on this? The reputation of natural gas among voters being, cleaner and sort of something that oil can match at this point?
To me, API, this is an education effort, and education costs money, and it takes time. And making fine distinctions. One of the things that stuck out to me about the poll that it's available to everyone is how specific a lot of the questions were. And that's great for the industry in drilling down, but educating people on kind of the finer points and nuances, it takes money to advertise and get that message out. And so it's certainly not impossible, but making a distinction between oil, natural gas companies, or what a company does, it's possible, but it's
a tough
significant
needle to
effort.
thread. So moving on to regulations. A lot of the poll dealt with, the renewable fuel standard, other regulations that they are hurting the industry at this point. And, you see that and you look at it and you see another partisan divide here because you've got Democrats saying, the government needs to have a firmer hand. You've got Republicans saying we must deregulate. And you've got the findings of this poll showing the voters with Republicans. So again, when it comes to these individual regulations, is it valuable to talk about them in terms of, all right, voters, do you support corn-based ethanol? Or broadly, in terms of voters, do you want the government playing this robust, muscular role? Or can we do both?
I think it depends upon your neighborhood. I think it depends upon the state or congressional district. Republicans tend to reflexively push back against the regulatory overreach under this president for what we talked about earlier, the four legs of the stool, and not just one industry, but really across the economy. And so I think that Republicans have been conditioned during the 2010 elections and the midterms, certainly last time as well, but I think it does depend upon your neighborhood and the impacts where you live.
Thoughts on that from the pollsters, opposing one particular regulation that hurts versus all regulation?
Well, one challenge that always faces businesses and industry groups and everything is that the idea of regulations, Americans think that that's a problem because it costs money, it red tape, slows things down.
Comes from Washington.
Right, and from pointy-headed bureaucrats. The flip side is when you ask them about specific regulations, now certainly there are ones that they give thumbs down to, but there are certain specific ones that they give thumbs up to as well, because they don't want businesses totally and industries totally unchecked either. So it's a fine balancing line of where is it that you push and say this is too much regulation, and that's going to cost jobs, it's going to hurt the economy, and in some instances make us less safe, or some of it's just nonsensical, versus the ones that people feel like, okay, we need that in place to help protect us. And I think Republicans go too far on one side, Democrats go too far on the other, and then the question is where's the public, and the public kind of meets somewhere in the middle.
Interesting. So regulations are like members of Congress, right? Like
Yeah.
pulled broadly, terribly, but their
Right.
individual congressman, he's all right.
Right.
Let's
Yeah.
keep him around.
Although there is a, I think, tilted playing field right now that's so anti-Washington that there is an opportunity to really position regulation in a negative light right now in the 2016 election. Unfortunately for the chamber, from my perspective, but there definitely is an opportunity. You see it out there, in what's happening in the Republican presidential nomination, but it's elsewhere as well. So, that's a very strong undercurrent theme and force in the 2016 elections.
Interesting. So to get specific about the Senate, we have Senator Ayotte in New Hampshire, we have Senator Toomey, we have Senator Kirk. My news outlet likes to call them, the most endangered Republicans. I mean, these are all states where, they're very swing. You have a lot of voters who do support multiple individual regulations, who do want to talk about climate change. Thoughts on the landscape for these particular three Republicans who could determine the balance of the Senate and how energy might play into these races? Any state that you might be following or have thoughts on?
I think
Well,
Nathan's here
I
for
think
that.
Ron Johnson will probably thank you for not including him in the most vulnerable list there.
Oh, well,
'Cause
put him in there too.
He should be up there. I think when you take a step back, I mean, the Senate is up for grabs. There are enough opportunities for Democrats to take back control. It's a little bit of a question on whether Democrats would need 4 and hold the Senate with the White House, or 5 to get a majority. But all of those senators are in extremely tough races. Some have primaries and some don't. But I think many of them will be close enough. Well, let's section off. I think Kirk and Johnson are kind of in one category, but I think Senator Toomey and Ayotte are in very close races that almost any issue could make the difference. I mean, whether it's energy or the overall landscape, every vote is going to matter in those races, and I think there's an opportunity for groups to take advantage of that.
I think each of those senators fit their state especially well. I mean, I give a tremendous amount of credit to Senator Tester last time, and also now Senator Heitkamp, who were able to swim against the Romney vote in both of those states. Senator McCaskill for a different reason. And so I think it's about those senators being able to fit their states, and if they are in fact successful, I think that gives them greater leverage, as we talked earlier about reestablishing a governing middle. These are folks who can point back and say, I fit my state. Do I agree with the U.S. Chamber on every issue? No. Do I agree with the API on every issue? Perhaps not. But the vast majority of the time, those senators that were just mentioned, Senator Ayotte's 95% cumulatively with the U.S. Chamber. So these are differences in terms of the geography that we respect deeply, and we will be active in each of those, and already have been active in each of those states that were referenced.
Mm-hmm. And yet you also see Senator Ayotte coming out and supporting the Clean Power Plan.
Yeah.
So do you think that these folks could provide kind of a roadmap to more compromise on energy issues if they make it through all this?
Look, I think that I respect the differences of opinion on a number of different issues, not just energy policy, but again, 95% cumulative with the chamber. That's a solid A. We'll take it. I'll be with Senator Ayotte in a couple of weeks talking about the issues where we do share a common view, and it's going to be, there are going to be races such as New Hampshire, obviously Senator Portman in Ohio, a number of other places, Colorado, as well as Nevada, where we're going to have an opportunity to have a robust debate about these issues, and we'll continue to be vocal, particularly on energy policy in those states.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thoughts on these Republicans from our polling experts?
Well, I think Rob nailed it right on the head, which is this is going to be a state-by-state situation, and some of the endangered or challenged Republicans will survive, and some others probably won't, unless there's a unexpected Republican tidal wave across in the presidential. One state that nobody has mentioned that's going to, I think, be a major Senate battleground too is Florida as well. So, when you start adding up, there's certainly enough for the Democrats, as Nathan pointed out, to take back control. On the other hand, there's also enough where you've got, high-quality candidates, like a Senator Portman or a Senator Ayotte, who, and I'm not leaving anybody out, but who have a chance to go out and, win the campaign through their own talents and strengths.
And then there's always Donald Trump possibility, which could drive a lot of Senate races one way or the other. So, there's going to be so much money spent on the presidential race, whoever the nominee on the Republican side is. And at this point, it still looks like it's going to be Hillary Clinton on the Democratic side. But there's going to be so much money spent. There's going to be so much demonization going on those races. It's hard to tell whether we're going to get ourselves into one of these 47 national elections where it's just to the death for a small percentage of the voters at the end, or whether we're really going to see some implosion on one side or the other, because it can certainly happen to Hillary Clinton, and it can happen to whoever one of the Republican nominees is, and that I think could make a 4 to 5 point swing in these Senate races, regardless of how well they run their races. You just get swamped, because as we've seen in the last 8, 10 years, elections are more nationalized than not, especially during the presidential elections.
And couldn't we see perhaps the opposite of the Trump effect, right? I mean, if Clinton becomes the nominee and starts talking about climate deniers a lot, that gives the opportunity for Ayotte and other Kirk to come out and say like, hey, let's ratchet this down and kind of play against that effect, the same way a Democrat might play against Trump potentially.
Yeah, it could. Or let's say Kentucky, Rand Paul, for whatever reason, in his race, the anti-coal movement from the Democratic Party could make it impossible, even though a Democrat might win today for governor, might not be able to take the Senate back, So there's all kinds of strange things that happen with energy, I think, playing into local races versus the national.
Well, let's move on then to talk about Colorado, because that's another race that is very important. It's a big oil and gas state. And it's coming full circle really, because we're close to the end. But in the beginning, we talked about the Udall-Gardner race and how Gardner was able to sell a really positive message that was all about energy production. Are you going to see the same kind of Gardner model be applied in this election? I mean, given the changes that the industry has undergone, or is it going to look different?
I think so. I mean, I commend whenever we meet with candidates, particularly for the Senate, but also in some of the key battleground House districts as well, particularly in the purple states, also in some primaries. We built a strong relationship with Senator Gardner back to the 2010 election, and I think he's taken a leadership role in mentoring candidates in terms of how to talk about energy policy, also not issues that we cover, but some of the social issues as well. He got out ahead of those issues with Senator Udall, and I think, frankly, Senator Udall was late to the game. I think Senator Bennett, though he has a chamber rating that is in the same neighborhood as Senator Udall, I think has gotten out ahead of it and done a good job of trying to find ways to create the image of being bipartisan on some important issues, and certainly Republicans haven't found a candidate yet. But I think that the Gardner model, I would also point to Senator Joni Ernst in Iowa, someone who was able to have a robust brand built in a primary and create a durable and distinct coalition on the center right, and then be able to apply that in a light blue to deep blue state, depending upon which election that you're looking at. And I think that the model that particularly Senator Gardner, as well as Senator Ernst applied, is one that you'd see incredible in a very salient way, particularly in a presidential cycle.
I think one of the challenges, because Cory Gardner's name comes up a lot this cycle, not only because he won the race, but that he got in March of the election year, so both parties even use that as an excuse, say, well, we don't have a recruit yet, but just wait, Cory Gardner didn't get in until March, so his name gets thrown out. But the thing that I keep thinking about is how much of Gardner's success is policy-driven and how much is personality-driven. My colleague Stu Rothenberg pointed out that Cory Gardner is kind of an interesting figure, something you don't see out in the wild very often, and that he's a conservative that smiles. He's a conservative that smiles, and that drove Democrats bonkers in the last election. And so, I think that he has provided a blueprint, but it's almost sort of like the Obama factor on the Democratic side, that Obama has had all the success. You say, okay, well, just do what Obama did. Well, no one else has been able to replicate that so far. So I think that's one of the challenges that Republicans have on the Gardner end.
Yeah, look, I think he is a force of personality, and there aren't that many Cory Gardners that are running. But it goes back to the mantra that we've all learned since 2010 and 2012, which is that candidates really matter. But he was also able, I think, particularly on energy policy, to take and use that personality in a way that also framed the issue set on energy policy in a way that was advantageous to him in his election in a state where energy policy obviously is highly contentious.
Interesting. So with that, it's time to turn to the audience for a little bit of Q&A. If anybody has any questions for our panel. I think there's going to be a mic running around.
Gentleman here.
If you wouldn't mind introducing yourself if possible before.
Oh my gosh, this is serious. I'm Randall Luthi with the National Ocean Industries Association. Really appreciate the comments we've heard so far, and I enjoyed, of course, looking at the survey. The survey seems to indicate that we want more oil and gas and more energy. However, I would like your thoughts is that we have done, or the industry has done such a good job of producing more oil and gas. Gasoline prices at the pump are so low that there's actually somewhat of an energy complacency out there, particularly when it comes to opening up new areas, say, offshore of the U.S. And it actually becomes quite a battle to say, even as we discuss the possibility of opening up the Atlantic, how difficult a battle that is becoming, particularly in the next year or so. What I'm saying is we're no longer concerned about $4 gasoline prices at the pump.
Well,
What difference does it make?
yeah, the challenge is, well, one observation is there is a sense among the voters that this is not, the $2 per gallon gas is not necessarily something that will last. They've seen this before where prices go down and then they spike up, and then prices go down and then they go back up again. And so even now there's just this kind of a sense of, okay, we better enjoy this while we can because, who knows when it's going to turn around and get worse. In terms of offshore oil drilling, the work that I've done on that issue, there is a partisan difference on that issue that you don't see on some of the others, in that Republicans and independents support it, whereas Democrats are much more mixed. Now, even then, in the states, for example, on the southeast Atlantic coast, even there, Democrats are relatively evenly divided for it. So, it's not like they're, like a lot of, when you think about a partisan issue, it's something that Republicans, let's say it's something Republicans support. Well, they support it 80-20, and Democrats oppose it 20-80. In this case, you have Republicans support it, at an 80-20 level, but Democrats are more evenly divided on it. So even though it's a more partisan issue when it comes to what you're seeing, for example, in the poll, it is still not as partisan as a lot of others. So there's the opportunity, I think, to continue to move forward, particularly with the message of, yeah, gas prices are low now, but we need to ensure that it's going to continue. This doesn't, this isn't just something you flip a switch and we suddenly, get this oil online overnight. So I think that would be the approach to it.
Yeah, the other interesting factor on that is that on the Democratic side, there's a great deal of support for energy production, not only offshore but also natural gas fracking among the African American community. They see the jobs component to it. They see the lower prices of energy. So there's a significant African American caucus within the House, that can help be a player in that. It's one of the things that keeps it from being a 2080 issue on the Democratic side. That strong support in that community.
Any questions from the audience?
Gentleman right there.
I'm Bill Holland. I'm a reporter with SNL Energy. I'm going to go back to his question again. We got plenty of gas. We got cheap prices. There's no crisis. Is it going to be trouble to get any face time at all for energy in this election cycle? There's just no motivation on the part of the general public to be concerned about it.
You want to take that?
Well, we've kind of touched on it at various points, but I think that the news of the day is going to help drive the election next year. And I could sit up here and tell you that this election is going to be about energy, or it's going to be about the economy, or ISIS, or foreign policy. But I think the truth is that until we get to August and September of next year, the news of the day is going to be at the top of people's minds. It's going to be what the candidates are going to have to respond to. It's going to be the topic of, it's going to be the debate questions that'll come up. And so it's possible that energy is at the forefront, but depending on where are gas prices, where is there a significant event that happens here or overseas that has to do with energy? But it's going to be crowded. Everyone's going to want to talk about what each party has their issues that they want to drive, and it's going to be a messaging battle.
Yeah, I don't think any one issue is going to dominate the election. It's certainly a year out. Obviously, public opinion can change based on events. There was certainly, the catastrophic recession just prior to the 2008 election. And, the economy was the top issue at that point in time, and then it just took over everything else. I think that right now we're looking at an election where you're going to have a number of different issues debated. Foreign policy, national security being up there, economy and jobs, because Americans still feel like, things aren't as bad as they were in 08 and 09, but, they haven't gotten, we're not moving forward. So that's certainly going to be an issue. And then, what else is going to be? Obviously, the Democrats, has been mentioned, want to make this an issue about the war on women. You have other issues that are going to be important. Energy certainly can play a role in that, just given, as I mentioned earlier, that it is a component of jobs in the economy, and it's a component of our national security, and it's a component of our foreign policy. So I think energy will be an issue, but the question is how big? Well, if I could predict the future, don't take it personally, I'd be in Vegas betting on football instead of being here with you guys today.
Good thing you can do that legally.
All right, next question from the audience. We have it? Seeing none, I will just follow up on a point that was made by Randall about energy complacency. Because I like that as a concept, because it relates to the next question we got about cost. Is without these high gasoline prices and cost threats keeping people worried about what they're paying for energy, is there a strategy that candidates can use to get people talking about it? Geopolitics has risen in prominence thanks to exports, but is there another sort of winning way to get energy into the conversation that you guys have heard of or thought of?
I think it's about really taking a long-term view. Whether you're at a company, whether you're at a trade association, or whether you're a candidate, is deciding what your issue mix and what your issue set is going to be, not knowing the uncertainty of not knowing what is going to pop 6 weeks before the election. Who's going to be your primary opponent? Do you have a competitive election in November or not? Are you in a state that's also a presidential battleground? So we know that big things that last in this town are always done on a bipartisan basis. So from a trade association perspective, and I know API takes this view, the Chamber is going to continue to advocate aggressively for each of the policies that we've discussed here this morning, and then look for windows and moments within the electorate in each of those Senate, states, and House races, and figure out whether that issue is in fact salient from a voter's perspective. And we're going to try to spend that money efficiently in order to create some synergy between what we believe from a policy perspective or a regulatory perspective, and finding a way to have a consequence once we get to the voting time.
Yeah. Well, it's always bad news and problems that dominate the political discussion in our country. But I'll take the opposite view, which is, again, and I mentioned this before, I think the Democrats, as the in-party in the presidency, trying to, as many Republicans have put, get the third term of Barack Obama in place in Hillary Clinton, need to talk about successes. They need to talk about job creation, opportunity, economic growth, keeping things going, making America number one, keeping prices down for consumers.
Or making America great
That
again.
is the ad campaign of Vote for Energy. That is the ad campaign of Vote for Energy. If you take the text and you take the ad campaign for Vote for Energy, it's a re-elect Barack Obama ad. And again, I know that problems and things that are wrong are what dominate our society, but I know it's hard to believe, but things are actually going well under a Democratic president. And if Americans, only 28% of them believe it now, if that can be 45%, it certainly helps elect a Democratic Senate and a Democratic president.
That's a provocative, closing discussion to have here, which is under a Democratic president, and I'm sure a lot of people in this audience would say it's, contra anything the president has done, but nonetheless, Democrats can go out there and say, look at what a Democratic president gave you in terms of your gasoline prices.
Well, thank
Drilling,
you.
drilling permits are at an all-time high. Maybe not as high as they could be, but
How,
they're
how,
at
do,
an
how
all-time
do you, if you're a Republican who wants more production, beat back against that?
Look, I think that it's always hard to win a third consecutive term, no matter what party that you're in. And I think that if you look across the issue set, and voters in both political parties are incredibly upset right now. And we talked about the primaries in the Republican Party. There are also 4 primaries in the Democratic Party in the Senate. And there are 10 in varying degrees on the House side. Now, we'll see what ultimately materializes. You mentioned Florida. I think it's the most challenging Senate race in the country. We also probably we'll have a primary in Indiana and perhaps in Louisiana as well, depending upon what happens in the governor's race. So look, I think that the electorate is surly. The middle has been lost, so it is a balance between what are the problems as we find ourselves before each of those primaries, particularly with a late primary, August 30th in Florida, and then what opportunities do we have to appeal to voters that show up in a presidential cycle who are looking, in some measure, for optimism to balance the things that they know because of their paycheck, because of the jobs that have been lost in a number of different states across the country, and a number of different industries in our membership that have been targeted. They don't have an optimistic view necessarily as they head into the voting booth, but we'll see. Certainly we have a year.
I think there's a reluctance, and Keith can correct me if I'm wrong, I think there's a reluctance to embrace the president because even though his job approval number has ticked up nationwide, in those key battlegrounds, in the key swing states on the Senate side, his job approval is lower than the national average. So if we take Illinois off, if we take kind of Wisconsin off, but in Pennsylvania, Ohio, New Hampshire, his job approval is lower than nationally. So there's that, well, there are these good things, but we don't want all the negatives that come with fully embracing him. And I think that's the Republican message will be tying every Democratic candidate to the president, and they're willing to take that chance in the election.
Just like 2014.
I also think that one challenge facing Keith's perspective that he laid out about how the low gas prices is thanks to Barack Obama, is going to be a difficult sell because, Hillary's opposed to all of this stuff. So I think that just makes it much more difficult for her to try and take
she's
credit.
opposed right now.
Yeah.
I mean,
Wait till
so-
Bernie
We're in the
Sanders
primary.
Wait till the
drops out,
makeover-
and
As you
that's
pointed
it.
out, we are in the primary.
Yeah.
Wait till the makeover in June. Is that what
There's
you're saying?
a certain flexibility that can apply here.
She was against it before she was for it.
Well, there you go. There's the ad right there. So any further closing thoughts about this that you would want to share, folks? Because it's been a great panel, and I thank you all for being here. Closing
Well,
thoughts?
that's kind of an open-ended, pretty open-ended question.
Anything we haven't talked about, Glenn, that you'd want to point out?
No, look, I think the key is going to be that from API's perspective and the people in this room who are interested in this issue, that this is one of those issues where you generally have a bipartisan consensus on a lot of it, not on everything, but on a lot of it. And I think you see that even, though it was against Obama's, the president's creed, as it were, the fact that, that these things have led to lower gas prices and lower energy costs and are certainly helping our kind of struggling economy from being, certainly keeping it from being worse off, I think underscores the importance of this issue and the fact that you do have the opportunity to make further policy gains because, again, it works, it helps the country, it helps our national security, and it does, in general, have a bipartisan, it's certainly not as polarized as most other issues.
Totally agree. I think that there is a bipartisan consensus on a number of these different issues, and if we're able to be successful on this suite of issues as well as the Regulatory Accountability Act and permit streamlining, it's a window into getting other big things done, like on other issues, repealing the medical device tax, also some trade issues. So if we can get the energy policy right in the next 6 months, 100 days of the first president, I think both parties, when you particularly look at the number of Democrats that are up in 2018, both parties can be invested in the outcome and in the result.
I think it's important to remember that our politics and campaigns have become so sophisticated that energy doesn't have to be the top issue in order to have an impact in the election. You can each party and candidate can identify specifically what voters is that the deciding issue and target them, through online or mail. People still do direct mail to get that message out. And some of these races, I believe these Senate races are going to be close. And so there's an opportunity there.
Well, we're in for a fascinating year. Thank you so much for being here on the panel today. Hope everybody enjoyed the discussion.
Always good to see you. Good to see you, Mayor. Thank
Thanks
you.
so much.
Yep, thank you.